Hello, I'm David Hepworth. Thanks for clicking this word in your ear, the latest of hundreds of chats Mark Allen and I have had over recent years, some between ourselves and others with musicians, authors, comedians, and other people we like. If you'd like to help make sure they continue, you might consider being a Patreon supporter by visiting patreon.com/wordinyourear. Or just by liking or subscribing in whatever way you prefer. On with the show.
You're listening to a podcast from The Word.
So this is the first time we've convened, Mark, I think, since the death of Kris Kristofferson. Is that right?
It is. No, we recorded last week, and I think he died sadly just the day after. Actually, sorry about sounding so croaky. By the way, there's one of our foreign listeners once sent in a thing saying how nostalgic it was to hear us in October and November, sounding like we'd got terrible colds, which indeed I have, because he said it made him feel homesick. But anyway,
yeah. So we're into the winter calendar
we are
now. Kris Kristofferson, unique character, I think, kind of amongst music stars, in the sense that so many music stars become big music stars because it's sort of the one thing they can do exceptionally well. Whereas Kris Kristofferson, this is not the case, because compared to most music stars, he was a Renaissance man, as we will explore. So, comes from Texas, born into a military family, father quite a senior officer who always wanted him to enter the military. At school, distinguished himself academically, but not just academically, also athletically, and was a star footballer. And when he went to college, and here's a curious thing for somebody who went to college in the United States, was a star rugby union player.
Yeah.
And I think he first came to some kind of national prominence. He was on the cover of Sports Illustrated, wasn't he?
He was, 58.
In 1958, talking about his prowess as a rugby player and so forth. And so he did so well at school and university that he became a Rhodes Scholar, and this scholarship set up to identify the potential leaders of nations all over the world and allow them a year or so studying at Oxford on Cecil Rhodes's inheritance. And so, the people who took advantage of that over the years, the likes of Bill Clinton was a Rhodes Scholar. Well, Kris Kristofferson was a Rhodes Scholar, so he comes to Oxford in the 50s. He gets an Oxford blue for boxing. Yeah. So here's another thing that makes him unlike loads of people who styled themselves country songwriters. He was clearly hard as nails, you know what I mean, along with everybody else. So he got a blue for boxing. He played rugby for his college, which is just extraordinary. But he also had time to make the acquaintance of legendary British rock and roll manager Larry Parnes, who thought he could make it as a rock star. And I can't remember the name of it. The record came out on the Top Rank label in the 1950s. That was he called Kris Carson or something like that. I think the K was still there on the first name. I think the second name was Carson. But then he goes back to the United States. He joins the military. He becomes a qualified, again, another string to his bow, okay, academically strong. Helicopter pilot.
I know.
Now, that's not an easy thing to do, I would have thought, Molly. They don't just let anybody be a helicopter pilot, do they? I would have thought that's probably harder than flying normal planes. I'm guessing. I know nothing at all. So he did that. He got married. He had children, but he still hankered after becoming a country songwriter, which is pretty extraordinary, really, having got to that stage in his life.
Where the whole thing is spread out in front of him. I mean, he just can move in any direction and he's completely qualified, isn't he?
I forgot to mention, he'd already, by this stage, had articles published in The Atlantic, which is a very prestigious American intellectual magazine of affairs and so forth. So he could have done anything. He must have been the kind of person that people were looking at. Some of his teachers must have looked at him and thought, you could be president of the
United States.
You must have thought that.
And he has those presidential looks, doesn't he?
Absolutely. Whereas I didn't mention, he's
old-fashioned American hero.
He's a handsome devil.
This
really
was
really obvious from very early on. So there is nothing he can't do. Anyway, he gets married. He has a couple of children, but he still wants to be, wants to make it in Nashville. So he leaves the wife and the children. He goes and works as a helicopter pilot in the Texas oil fields.
On the rigs.
Yes.
Dredging contractor. They say the hardest job. I thought that was really interesting because there's Springsteen writing songs about, the blue collar life of
never
working.
done a day's work in his life. Never. Bruce Springsteen literally never done a day's work in his life apart from being a musician. Kris Kristofferson had done all these things. You know what I mean? In the military and out of the military. So he was kind of living, do you know what he reminds me of? If you're familiar with that wonderful Jack Nicholson film, 5 Easy Pieces, where Jack Nicholson plays a character who comes from a very cultured East Coast family where they all play piano to a really high standard and so forth, and he just turns his back on it. He goes and works on wildcatting out in the oil fields, and lives a completely blue-collar life. Well, Kris Kristofferson kind of did that. But at the same time, he was going and spending the weekends in Nashville doing anything to try and bring his songs to the attention of people who might cover them.
And there's at this point, wasn't there an extraordinary intervention from his mum and dad, which you can really understand, actually. This guy had gone off and had been a Rhodes Scholar, incredibly academically qualified, all the things we've been talking about. And they then discovered that he's packed it all in to go to Nashville. And they wrote him a letter, didn't they?
Yeah.
And effectively disowned him. And the letter said, nobody over the age of 14 listens to that kind of music, by which they meant country and western.
Yeah,
said, and if they did, there wouldn't be somebody that we would want to know. Now, can you imagine that? I mean, I can
I can imagine. I can
totally,
well
I can really understand it. Yes. They must have been heartbroken.
Well, this is like Bill Clinton turning around at the age of 23 and saying, I no longer want to be governor of Arkansas. I want to go and sweep studios in Nashville in order to get my songs into the hands of Johnny Cash or Willie Nelson or whoever. But he did sweep studios.
He did.
He always used to reckon he swept studios during Dylan recordings, didn't he? That he was there during Blonde on Blonde, I think, is what is one of the myths that gathered around him. And then he started getting film roles. Have you ever seen a film called Cisco Pike?
No.
It's quite an obscure indie film, but that was very important in kind of making his mark, where he played an up and coming singer songwriter. It starts with him taking his guitar to the pawn shop because he's just about to jack it in again because it hasn't worked at all, But clearly people in films had already spotted his extraordinary charisma, that he is the kind of person you pointed a camera at and sparks flew. And so
I think I first saw him in Pat Garrett and Billy the Kid. And that's just
of course.
Wonderful. Just his appearance in that. Is he the kid? I can't remember what part. He's quite a significant part. And he's just fantastic. So good looking.
So good looking. And so
real old school American hero. And yet a combination of old school and the new hero, the kind of bohemian, literate, soft-centered, really unusual.
Yeah, because he played very often on the screen. He played somebody who wasn't massively successful.
Yeah,
but because by then he was massively successful.
Yeah,
it was the whole kind of beautiful loser idea. of course, his first real breakthrough song is "Help Me Make It Through the Night," which apparently he wrote based on something Frank Sinatra had said in an interview about, I rely on booze, broads, and anything that helps me make it through the night. It's a rather glib line. I don't know if it means anything, but you can imagine it appealing to somebody who wanted to write a song. And of course, that becomes a huge hit. And here's one of the things about Kris Kristofferson. I think he's the first big, what you would call crossover hit, in that he wrote these ballads which were adopted not just in country music. Country music was his initial target, but they crossed over to soul and to kind of middle of the road and pop and absolutely everything. I've got in front of me a list, and I'm only going to read you some of them, of the people who covered Help Me Make It Through the Night, okay? So Elvis Presley, Gladys Knight, Joan Baez, Willie Nelson, Sammy Smith, Tammy Wynette, Percy Sledge, Bobby Darin, Johnny Cash, John Holt, the reggae star, who had a big hit, Bryan Adams, Bobby Bare, Ike and Tina Turner, Jeannie C. Riley, Brian Ferry, Jerry Lee Lewis, Charlie Pride, Paul Carrack. I could go on. Just thousands of cover versions of these songs.
So he must have made a very significant amount of money.
Oh, God. He must have made a lot of money. And, and then that led to a very significant Hollywood career, because he was he was the housewife's crumpet, wasn't he? He was the kind of the fantasy figure, the bearded fantasy figure. I will come to take you away from all this.
Yes.
Kind of thing. And then they could put him on absolutely anything, any TV variety show. He was just one of those figures who kind of brought America together. In all kinds
Did you follow the story of the writing of Me and Bobby McGee?
Oh, go on.
Which is amazing. As far as I can see, what happened was he's working with Fred Foster, Monument Records founder and producer. And Fred just called him up one night and said, I've got a song title for you. He said, it's Me and Bobby McGee.
Oh, really?
Bobby McGee was a secretary who worked in the building. And he said, the twist is that Bobby McGee is a she. So go away and write a song about it. It's quite interesting. And he'd misheard it, actually, and thought it was Me and Bobby McGee. Oh, wow. But he liked the idea. And he then said that he'd seen this film, Strada. It's a Fellini film.
Fellini film, yeah.
That's right. And the story very basically is the guy who's traveling with this girl who plays the trombone, and they kind of have this sort of vague attraction, and then he just kind of leaves her in the end. He leaves her by the side of the road while she's sleeping. And at the end of the film, he goes back to the town and he hears a woman singing the song that this girl used to play when they were busking, on the trombone. He says, where did you hear that song? He said, well, a girl turned up a few years ago in this town, and she was a trombone player. And she just got into very dire straits, and eventually she died. And the film ends with this guy howling at the moon, drunk and just absolutely, just paralyzed with misery about what's happened. And Kris Kristofferson thought this was the point he wanted to expand on. The idea that the Bobby McGee song, that the character had left Bobby McGee, and only when he realized that she'd gone did he realize. So he had the freedom when she'd gone, but then he lost his freedom because all he wanted to do was to trade all his tomorrows for one yesterday. And I thought it was a really amazing way of writing a song, that you pick on one particular emotion from one particular film and expand from there into the story. Because it's a really extraordinary story, I think.
I think it's, I love thinking about the days when publishers like, Fred Foster used to just suggest titles to people.
Yeah.
Say, go off and write me a song, based on that. And they would,
Yep.
Was it, the famous story about Jerry Wexler, the great Atlantic producer, bumped into Carole King and her husband, Jerry Goffin, at some kind of, her then husband, Jerry Goffin, some kind of function, and says, I want a song for Aretha Franklin called Natural Woman. That's all. Just write me a song called Natural Woman because I think it suits the image. And so they did. Of course, the lyrics "You Make Me Feel" by a natural woman, like a natural woman, were written by Jerry Goffin, who didn't know anything about feeling,
Absolutely,
being the husband in the partnership.
But I would imagine if you're a songwriter, everyone thinks that you're just sitting there. You're this divine conduit, that's just downloading something from the ether. But you will respond to a commission. It's a job. I apply my art to this brief.
Yeah,
you can imagine that being really attractive, actually.
Yeah. Well, and Kris Kristofferson went on to do it many, many times. And of course, had his big Hollywood career and Star is Born and so forth. And Heaven's Gate, of course, which was very overblown film. But he's kind of magnificent in it,
Yeah, he is.
He had, it's surprising he's not more often in the conversation where people sit around trying to think which rock stars made it as actors, whereas he genuinely did.
But if you don't pursue one aspect of all the things that you do, then you do tend to get slightly forgotten, I think. Had he kept touring as Kris Kristofferson all his life, he'd probably be just better known.
Yeah, maybe.
But he was just involved in all sorts of other things, Also, another interesting thing that I only just discovered was that he'd never heard Janis Joplin's version of Me and Bobby McGee until after she died, because she recorded. They were having.
It was a hit. It was a hit after she died. Yeah.
Yeah, they were having a love affair. And I don't think he even knew that she'd recorded. He was called up by the record company, and they said, "Look, come and hear this." And he said it was just one of the most emotional things in his life, to hear this song done by her. And she was no longer around.
No, she's no longer around.
Yeah, extraordinary.
Had an extraordinary, very, as you can imagine, heavily populated love life. Back in the day, obviously, Janis
married
Joplin.
Rita Coolidge.
Married Rita Coolidge, and they recorded many albums together. But also he had an affair with Carly Simon.
Yeah.
So, he wrote "I've Got to Have You." So he's about her. And so he's part of that little bubble that happened in 1970, 71, 72.
With James Taylor.
All James Taylor, Leonard Cohen, Joni Mitchell, they all went to bed with each other and they all wrote songs about it. And none of them made any secret about the fact that they'd written songs about it and were asked about it for the rest of their lives. And no, it's extraordinary. He touched a lot of bases. Of course, was a member of the Highwaymen, wasn't he?
Yeah,
With, on your favorite Jimmy Webb song. And was misdiagnosed with Alzheimer's late in life, wasn't he?
Oh, right. So not unlike Johnny Cash, actually, was misdiagnosed, wasn't he?
Oh, was he? Really? Okay.
Well, Johnny Cash was told he only had a short period of time to live, and he kept making this series of records, and this is going to be my last album. The kind of touch of the Wilco Johnson, really. And I think after 10 years, he said, I'm feeling pretty good.
Fine.
I don't feel that bad, actually.
It's a bit like Mark Ellen today.
Like me. It's right on the men.
He'll suddenly strike a perfect high C.
Yeah, exactly. I thought I was going to be pushing up daisies about 20 minutes ago, but I'm definitely things are looking up.
So anyway, Kris Kristofferson, there he goes. We shall not see his like again.
The Word Podcast, prime cuts of popular culture served fresh each week.
I think you've read, as I have, the piece that was in the New Statesman by Tracey Thorn about selfies. It had a very, very good headline, actually, is "Has social media pushed fandom to a point of no return?" And the basic point she made, oh my God, I felt sympathetic, was that when she said, I've been vaguely famous for 40 years, just vaguely, in that kind of way, Everything But the Girl and Forming the Marine Girls. And, I've just been in a sort of slightly indie way. And the people who occasionally stopped me in the street were very polite. There are fans. They're very respectful. Could I bother you for an autograph? Oh, thanks very much. She said, everything's changed completely now since the advent of the iPhone, because nobody wants an autograph. They want a selfie.
Yeah.
And the selfie is a massive, massive intrusion. She gave 2 examples. One was how she was sitting down in I think it was in a pub the other day, and I think she might have just come back from jogging or something like that.
And no, she was waiting for her daughters, wasn't she?
Waiting for her daughter, that's right. And this guy sits next to her and says, "Do you mind if I take a selfie?" And she says, "Do you mind if I say no?" Because she's being very polite. And instead of accepting this answer, he then immediately starts taking pictures of her. And she's really, really upset about this, you know. And she said later on she'd been, I think she'd been out jogging and kind of, you know, no makeup and all that.
Sure.
And then somebody stops her and wants a picture. And then when she doesn't want to give a picture, he goes on social media saying what an absolute bitch she is. And this was the location that he found her in. And so the implication was she comes there all the time because that's where her gym is. And he just thought, I really, really thought this is dreadful. There was another example of this. Stuart Lee wrote a thing in The Observer about 2 weeks ago about going to see Neil Young. He absolutely adores Neil Young. And he went to see Neil Young in Hyde Park. And he said every 30 seconds for pretty much the entire performance, because once somebody identifies, oh, that's Stuart Lee, you think, well, I might as well go and get a picture. Mm-hmm. He said he could not concentrate on Neil Young. He was in this kind of terrible, terrible kind of rictus grin. And if you say no, it's going to be friction, you know. And I thought that was really, what an appalling intrusion that is. Because it's then something that's going to be there forever. That picture will live forever on the internet, no matter how unflattering and how grim it is. And if you don't let this person take the picture, then they're going to be possibly really abusive and really, I thought, my God, less and less. This is a time to be a famous person. Don't you think?
Absolutely. I think I told you about this quite a few years back. I was walking through Bloomsbury one afternoon, and I passed Simon Pegg, who clearly just been stopped by a couple of, it's kind of, it's an exaggeration to say fans, because I think it now goes way beyond fans. It's not just the people who are fans who stop Simon Pegg. It's the people who vaguely recognise Simon Pegg who stop.
People trying to just get a few hits on their Instagram. It's entirely about that. It's got nothing to do with Simon Pegg a lot of the time.
And there he was. He was having to explain to the two of them how to take the picture because he clearly done it tens of thousands of times. And this is 10 years ago that this happened. Yeah. God knows how many times he's had to do it since. So he almost had to help them to do it. Help them to do a thing he didn't really want them to do, but it would seem rude, and dismissive not to be involved in it in the first place. And I felt so sorry for him. I think it's ridiculous because it's so true what you say. Well, it was the same thing in the days of autographs. We've discussed this before. Paul McCartney walks through Soho and keeps moving, never stop. Because once you sign one, a queue will form.
You've got to look like you're in a hurry. You've got a destination and you're late.
Yeah, and I don't see what's going to stop this, because
I can't see it. And the other thing is that an autograph is it's a beautiful object, actually. Somebody's signed a menu, or they've signed your autograph book, or they've signed an album sleeve or whatever, That's an artifact that you could frame and you could put on your wall, and it would give you pleasure every day, and people would admire it and understand it. But that kind of blurred picture of you kind of pulling your typical Instagram face with this harassed and slightly narrow-eyed individual who doesn't look remotely at their best is kind of valueless, isn't it?
Oh, it's
totally valueless.
It's awful. I don't see what's going to stop it at all, because I'm sure, as Tracey Thorn said in that piece, most people are perfectly pleasant. most people are not pushy, or anything like that. But it only takes a few who are to completely ruin your day, if you have some kind of interaction like that. And you can see why people, certain people are surrounded by minders just purely so that they don't have to deal with saying no to people. It's a wall of flesh around them that does all the fending off for them, you know.
Well, Stuart Lee's also part of his argument, it kind of peripherally, was this whole idea of, you know, Keir Starmer and the free football tickets. He says, you get to a level of celebrity where you can't go in the stands anymore. You just can't. And so, you know, you to be in a corporate box or something at least means you can watch the game and that you're not being constantly bothered. You're in a kind of, your circumstances are in some kind of control. And I thought that was interesting too, actually, because, you know, you get to the point where you can't do any of this stuff. We had that conversation about, I remember during Live Aid, and I think it was Robbie Williams saying that when he had to wear a mask, Live Aid, during COVID, that he could go to Sainsbury's and, you know, he never normally went to Sainsbury's, and how absolutely incredible it was to be able to go to a supermarket without anyone bothering him because they didn't know who he was because he's wearing a mask. I thought that's extraordinary.
Maybe anyway, here's a proposal of as the way we get past this particularly difficult stage in the human race. This is what I propose. We should promote the idea that there is huge kudos to be gained from spotting famous people from spotting a famous person and not letting on that you've done it. You know what I mean? Because people always feel, oh, if I saw a famous person and I didn't say, oh, look, there's Bruce Springsteen, I would somehow be, my social standing would be lower because I haven't openly recognized them. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Whereas you ought to get higher social standing for recognizing them and not saying anything about it. Like the other week, like I told you, I was in the London Library and I was putting my coat away and there was Tom Hanks putting his coat away.
Yeah.
And obviously it would have been very uncool to say anything, whatever. And I kind of feel a bit of a warm glow every time I tell that story to you or anybody. And I saw Tom Hanks, and of course I didn't say anything about it. I wouldn't dream of doing it. You know what I mean? That ought to be the thing that we ought to.
It is. I was immensely admiring of that, and still am.
You would have done the same thing, wouldn't you?
Yeah, absolutely.
You know, because it's kind of a bit gauche, isn't it? I give you a tiny example from years ago. My wife and I, and kids actually, we were staying in a very posh hotel down in the West Country. And staying there at the same time was William Roach, who was Ken Barlow in Coronation Street. And, you know, so every time Ken Barlow came into a bar or a public room, people would go, look, Ken Barlow. And I didn't say anything at all. And then one day I got in a lift and he got in and there was just me and him. And then I said, well, it's a bit of a cliche to say I've seen you before, you know. And he just kind of smiled and then we got out. And
that's good. You have to acknowledge it.
Well, I didn't really. Actually, if I think about it now, I didn't have to acknowledge it.
Yeah.
Actually. But I suppose the danger was, inverted commas, if I hadn't said anything to him, he might have thought I didn't recognize him.
Well, that's the problem. You don't want to hurt his feelings
Yes.
by not knowing who he was. Somebody you're in the perfect demographic to know. Is he going to go away crushed, thinking, my God, I'm on the slide?
No, not at all.
It's an impossible situation.
It's an impossible situation.
I know.
But anyway, you know, if, you know, don't press your attentions on people, particularly people who don't want to volunteer for selfies. Don't push it. Don't be unpleasant. You know, it's on all of us.
This is a junction in the word podcast. It separates that bit from this next bit.
I saw this film this week, which I think is going to be in cinemas next week. Really, I thought it was really worth seeing. It's Cameron Crowe's first ever film director role. It was a film called Heartbreakers Beach Party that he made in 1982, 1983 for MTV. And it was shown once, it was commissioned by MTV, and it was shown once on MTV, very early days of MTV, and they thought it was too experimental. It was only shown once and it was kind of dropped and never been seen again. And it's experimental in that it's quite long and it's quite a complicated sell for the uninitiated. And, there's surreal bits where they're in the desert dressed as kind of bandits, digging up a ghetto blaster and all that kind of stuff. There's a bit where you see Tom Petty being interviewed, but he's on a black and white television screen and a still photograph of a 1950s all-American family. So it's a bit arch. But I thought it was really interesting because it's just a little time capsule into what life was like in 1984. This is 1984, so Tom Petty would have been 32. Cameron Crowe is, whatever he was, 25. And it's, what he wants to do is to be filmed riding around Los Angeles in the back of a limousine, drinking scotch and coke, and that idea that they get across is that the heartbreakers are these kind of banditos who blow into town and they charm your women and they drink your beer and then they blow out of town again, And it seemed so wonderfully dead. Also, it's about promotion, about analog promotion. You have to go out and sell yourself. At one point, Tom Petty undertakes to be interviewed at a college, and the student gets up, and his first question is, he's the guy actually who's curating the whole thing, he's running as the chair. His first question is, what are the words of the second verse of American Girl? Because I can't quite work them out, and I'm playing them in my band. Right. So that's the kind of level you're on, But I did think it was really interesting that you're there in a world where the romance is all about being on the road. It's all about the tour bus and traveling and, the road hogs, and that Cameron Crowe hangs on every syllable that Tom Petty deigns to utter. It's that wonderful, rather like the character actually in Almost Famous. Do you remember the young journalist who was in fact playing him when he was at Rolling Stone interviewing whatever they're called, Stillwater, terribly earnest with his tape recorder trying to get every syllable from these people, And I thought it was just so funny how times have changed, that back then a rock star, because they wrote songs, you somehow felt that they were wise and quotable and infinitely fascinating. And, he asks, when he's interviewing the drummer, he says, what do you think about when you're playing the drums? And it just made me think, this is just a real period piece. You should see it. You'd enjoy it.
This is, it's funny you should say this because I was in the Isle of Wight this weekend doing a literature festival thing. And an old colleague of mine and ours, Wendy Varley, came along. You remember Wendy?
Yeah, I do.
Wendy and I used to work together on teenage magazines and so forth. And she still has her diaries from, all those years ago. So she wrote everything down,
Wow.
in a way that most people don't. And she, recently rediscovered them, and she's been doing some writing based on them. And I said, you should just kind of publish them, really, you know what I mean? Because the unvarnished thing is the thing that's really exciting. It's if you're vaguely embarrassed by them, they're probably true. They're probably really
and they
interesting.
have some value.
They have some value. And
if you're embarrassed by them, they're it's honest.
And it's like I never believe. Sorry, so it's like as an aside. I never believed that Radio 4 series in which celebrities used to apparently read their teenage diaries.
Yeah,
I thought that those aren't real teenage diaries. Those are made up last week. Anyway, and the point I was making to Wendy is I think you've sort of got to go back to 40 years ago, which is the time you're talking about with Tom Petty and the time she was talking about in her diaries. You've sort of got to go back 40 years now for it to feel like the past.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Because it's pre-mobile phones, it's pre-digital media, it's pre-all kinds of things. And so you look at the things that you did every day in 1984 or whatever, and you can't believe you did them. You know what I mean? Is that how the world operated?
Yeah.
And she was telling me about she had to take some competition winners to Wembley Stadium to see Queen, to meet Queen, to go to the gig and go and meet them on stage. And you just basically, in those days, you just turned up at Wembley Stadium, I think having gone on the tube, you turned up, and you went to a doorman, some major domo wearing a uniform and said, I'm here to see Queen backstage, and you eventually did somehow. And there was no other means of communication other than that.
Yeah.
And I thought it was just absolutely extraordinary. But you've kind of got to go back 40 years.
40 years. It's pre-mobile phone. It's just a different era, isn't it?
It is. Whereas
we've had this conversation before. I keep finding old postcards up on the roof that I got from people, and they just simply say, "See you in the Shakespeare's Head, 6:00 on Thursday." That's a text message. But it was sent as a postcard with a hilarious caption on the front, or a sort of speech bubble had been added or something. That's just what it was. Whereas when you might send one back saying, "Okay, see you there."
Whereas post all this technology and social media, the kind of past has flattened out.
Yeah,
it doesn't feel like the past anymore. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
It feels like we've all been living in the same present for 30 years. Well, it can't be true at all, but that's kind of the way it feels. Whereas you go back to the 80s, now that starts to feel like something very different. It starts to feel like the Middle Ages. It's so extraordinary.
It does. This thing, I think, it feels like period drama.
Yeah.
It's just extraordinary now. You see long-haired guys with Scotch and Coke and limousines and slightly flared trousers and cowboy boots, and you just think, wow, what a different world it was.
And I bet at no stage does anybody apologize or explain.
Not remotely.
The Word Podcast. Fix yourself a drink and it's like being in the pub.
And now we're joined by Patreon birthday boy, Paul Cook. Hello, Paul. How are you?
Good morning. I'm well. Thank you very much.
When was the birthday?
It was September the 27th.
Oh, right. Okay. So we're not too far removed. Sorry about that.
I share it with, apart from Good King Wenceslas, Alvin Stardust and Randy Bachman.
Very good. Excellent. Let's rock.
Yeah. That's right. And Gwyneth Paltrow, but I don't do my own range of candles.
Okay. So as is traditional in these cases, our birthday guests throw a bit of a log on the conversational fire that is word in your ear. Do you have such a log, Paul?
I do, but before I do, I should warn you that in case you hadn't recognized me, I think I've been a Patreon for about 4 or 5 years now. If you've seen me at any of the events, I would be sitting next to...
Oh, of course, sitting next to Vivian Stanchel, Keith Hasley.
Which rather overshadows you, actually.
It renders you invisible.
It does.
Wherever you go, he is known, and you just stand by the side of him and just think, this is wonderful.
He's there dispensing vegan snacks to all and sundry. What's your question, Paul?
So my question is for the two of you, really, because a few years back, we started going, this is my partner, Kate and I, abroad for gigs. So quite often you would go and see an artist that was huge here, but actually still on the way up, and tie it in with a bit of a holiday. And I wondered, I know you've probably been paid to go places, but where's the furthest you've gone to see someone on your own dime?
God,
well, gosh,
I'm shamefully, I don't have a lot to boast about in this respect, because it's interesting you should say this, because this habit of people going abroad to see gigs is a relatively recent phenomenon, isn't it? We're talking about the last, I suppose, 10 years, and now it's an increasingly common one. I hear from people all the time saying, I've just come back from Florida seeing the Rolling Stones or whatever, which would have been pretty much inconceivable.
Because people go because they can't get a ticket here, or because it's sometimes cheaper, isn't it? Abroad?
It's sometimes cheaper. And also people travel much more readily now than they ever did before. I can remember, and this will be 40 years ago, I can remember my friend Steve and I pretty much touring the UK in pursuit of Bruce Springsteen and the E Street Band. We went to Glasgow, went to Newcastle, went to Birmingham, and whatever. We didn't go outside the UK. We wouldn't have. That would have been considered going too far in those days. But people clearly do that nowadays. What about you, Mark?
Well, disgracefully, I suppose, from about 1977 onwards, for the best part of, 40 years or something, I was getting free tickets, as Paul was saying. And so that did rather put a dent in things. But the longest I think I went was just up to Edinburgh with my eldest son to see Tom Waits. And we both love Tom Waits, and he's a particularly obsessive fan. And we thought we were going to go up and see him. And that was an adventure. That was a great adventure. The train journey up, and that was just a brilliant night. But no, it's not very far, really.
It's kind of like the thing I remember Steve and I likening it to, and this is 40 years ago, it's extraordinary. We said this is like following a football team. It's an away fixture. You know what I mean? And you kind of look forward to going to away fixtures in certain cities and certain stadiums and so forth. So what about you, Paul?
I think the first thing that we did, where we went to see an artist who I thought I'd actually heard through the word, but actually I know I've talked to Alex about this before, and he doesn't think she was ever on your compilations, but an artist called Sumi. And we just decided to go to Helsingborg, which is sort of on the coast of Sweden, and then got the train up to Gothenburg. So we saw her twice, which unfortunately was at a book club, which we didn't know. We thought it was a gig with other people, and it was a full
all that way. It was just a book club.
There was lots. So we sang it, but every other thing, there was a 15-minute monologue by someone, and we were stupidly in the front row. And,
oh no, Lord! And you're sitting there computing the amount of money you spent getting there. Kicking yourselves.
We flew into Copenhagen, then got the train across the bridge, and and went to Helsingborg. So it was nice, and that sort of started it. We went to Norway to see her as well. So it's like a way of going and seeing places. We're usually in Scandinavia, where you have to sell a kidney to buy a beer. But
yes.
I think my friend Richard, he tried to get tickets. You remember when Kraftwerk did the 5 nights at the Tate Modern, and their ticket system collapsed, so no one could get through. In fact, you would actually had more chance if you actually cycled down to the Tate Modern and went to the box office there, because they had no one waiting. But he couldn't get a ticket. He was on the phone for, I think, 12 hours straight listening to an Engaged tone. And that spurred him on. He bought a ticket and went to see them in Barcelona at a festival where it was about 30 degrees.
Perfect.
Whereas I think on the night I went, it was just tipping it down with rain. So I think he probably got the better end of the deal.
I think you could reverse this and say, what's the least distance that you've ever had to travel? Because I once saw Bob Dylan when he played literally half a mile from where I was born, Blackbush Airdrome, and I once saw him half a mile from where I am now, which is Shepherd's Bush Empire. I thought, I'm not going to wait to go and see Dylan. I'm going to wait till Dylan comes to see me.
Yes, bloody right.
Bloody right. It was perfect.
Aerodrome does seem like a very strange place. I mean, it seems quite dangerous to put a gig on an aerodrome.
It was. Standing on tarmac all day.
I drive past it quite regularly nowadays when I go down there to see a friend. And it's a car auction nowadays, isn't it? Like Bush Aerodrome. It's just utterly flat. You think there is no vantage point here from which you could see anything at all.
Nothing.
Now, it's funny you should talk about the bridge from Copenhagen, because I've never gone to a foreign country to see a band, but I have gone to a foreign country to have my hair cut, which is, wife and I were in Copenhagen, and we said, let's go across the bridge, on the train across the bridge to, is it Malmo you get to when you come to the other side? We got to Malmo, and when she said, well, what now? I said, well, I need a haircut. So she said, there's a men's hairdresser. I just walked in, had my haircut, and then we got on the train and went all the way back. So, I like to boast that I travel the world to have my hair cut. So there you go.
And was it obscenely expensive?
It probably wasn't any more than it would have been in the West End of London.
It's the kudos of
it was the kudos.
That's the
being able to say that.
But you can go and get your hair cut is something I'm very envious of.
All right. Sorry about that. Sorry about that.
Very luxurious hair,
Yeah, if only Mark Ellen's was real, it's really lets us slide down,
etc.
Well,
Yeah, it actually did occur to me that I think in the back of the music magazines, you used to be able to go and do coach tours across to gigs in Europe.
Yes,
Yeah,
you did.
But
You
I
did.
Oh, yeah, I used to go to the Happy Mondays in Paris. We once sent Chris Heath from Q Magazine on the Happy Mondays tour, Charabang to Paris.
What a nightmare.
It was a brilliant piece,
Is
just
he
the
still on the
funniest
coach
piece.
with the fans? I imagine they
Yeah.
had no idea where they were.
Can you imagine being on a coach with Happy Mondays fans in 1987?
Oh, my God.
I mean, they did try and sell the sofa in the studio in Jamaica, didn't they? I think.
Oh, right. Yes, of course.
To buy substances.
Yeah. Well, look, Paul, thanks very much for raising that topic about traveling to foreign countries to see gigs. Thanks very much for joining us on the occasion of your birthday. And we'll next time we see you alongside Keith, we shall take more notice of you than Keith.
You won't. It's not possible. It isn't possible.
We'll try. We'll try.
This podcast was brought to you by The Word.